Okay, good afternoon, everybody. こんにちは、皆さん。みんな元気にしていますか？寝てないですか？Thank you for coming to my talk. I know Konifa-san is also presenting right now on a very similar topic, so thank you very much for coming. My name is Siena Aguayo. In Japanese, I go by Siena, so that is also fine if you want to call me that. This is my talk on fearless internationalization and localization across the nations. The word fearless here is not there by accident. It's one of my company Indiegogo's 4 core values. I feel that internationalization often gets a bad reputation. It's something that people don't really want to bother doing the setup up front, so they sort of leave it till later. But I'm here to hopefully make you less afraid to do some of this work up front so that you don't incur too much technical debt later when it's time for you to take over the world and make your app available in many different languages. So I just wanted to get a quick audience survey. How many of you are developing an app in more than one language right now? Very few of you. And the rest of you, are you mostly in English? Yeah, a few in Japanese? German? Okay, cool, cool. So hopefully there's some content here for all of you. So a quick overview. We're going to go over what are L10N and I18N. Why should I care about these things? How do I internationalize my Android app? And finally, some other cool things that you can do. Like I mentioned, I work for a company called Indiegogo. We're a crowdfunding company headquartered in San Francisco. There I've done iOS, Android, and most recently Rails and Angular. And I came to Indiegogo via a programming bootcamp called Hackbright Academy, programming bootcamp for women in San Francisco. I was part of a very small team that shipped our first Android app in English, Spanish, French, and German. So that's where my experience lies. I'm sorry that none of these are right-to-left languages. They're also all Latin alphabets, so maybe I'm really interested to hear from Japanese members of the audience what some of their particular challenges are. So first of all, let's start with some definition of terms. What are L10N and I18N? How many people sort of had like an, oh, I get it now moment when they realized what the numbers in these phrases were for, right? It's not immediately obvious to you, or it wasn't to me anyway, that the numbers in these phrases actually stand for the number of letters in between the first and last letter. So let's define localization. Probably the first thing you think of when you think about localizing is you want to actually translate the content that's in your app to a different language. But something you might not be quite so aware about is you also need to display your data differently according to your target language. So this can include things like dates, numbers, currencies, all that is potentially displayed differently. You might also need to adjust your company's branding according to the target culture. There might be something you use as part of your business that might need to be explained slightly differently in a different context. And you might be thinking, these are all, this is all well and good, but I don't actually decide what language I translate my app into. That's probably someone else's decision, right? So this is sort of more the business side of things. Internationalization, on the other hand, I'm going to define as preparing your app for localized content. So in Android, this might mean things like defining alternate strings and other resource files, using number and date formatters, and also designing and implementing flexible layouts. So hopefully this sounds more like your job. This is the more engineering side of the house, and those are the definitions I'm going to use. So localization and internationalization, it's not just translation. Thanks for laughing. So why should I care about any of this stuff even? I'm very happy writing my app in only one language that's the language that I speak. Well, I want to talk a moment about empathy, partially because I think this is something that doesn't get talked about enough in technical contexts, but we as human beings should be invested in making sure that people of all kinds all around the world have access to our apps and the great technologies that we're building upon. So I think that you should be able to connect to this on a human level. And I'm just by virtue of the fact of us being in Japan and I'm giving this presentation in English, we're already operating on a very multilingual context in here. So I think probably each of you can relate to wanting to make your app available in multiple languages. And I think this is really key to our culture as Android developers, right? Because Android is available on phones both at the low and the high end, all around the world, and you know, be together, not the same, that kind of thing. So I think that this is really fundamental. It's really. But in case you're an unfeeling robot and empathy means nothing to you, I'd like to try to appeal to you from a technical perspective as well. First of all, separation of concerns is always a good thing. So being able to separate out that localized content and be able to silo it in this way is really excellent for the organization and readability of your app. And in case you're thinking, well, you know, I really like reading through all my Java code and seeing all these strings hard-coded. It just helps me remember what's going on. Well, I'd like to show you this. This just happens all the time. You probably don't even notice. But this little explore part that looks like maybe it's hard-coded in English is actually not. It's actually an ID, and Android Studio just sort of superimposes the default translation for you, which I think is pretty cool. I want to talk a moment about YAGNI. This is something we talk about a lot at my company, Indiegogo, and it stands for "You ain't gonna need it," which is some colloquial English that actually means you're not going to need it. And we use this in the context of talking about over-engineering. So we follow a lot of the agile methodologies. We want to implement our features in the smallest scope possible and keep things very simple and move very fast. So some people like to use this sort of principle to argue against really doing some of this upfront preparation for localization. They might say, well, we don't know if we're going to localize, we don't know when we're going to localize, we don't know what language we will localize to, so why should we bother to do any of this? But I've seen this happen. That will always come back to bite you later. There's really some simple things you can do to just ease that transition, and then you don't have a lot of technical debt built up for when you decide you do need to localize. So how do I internationalize my Android app? And if you've been paying close attention, you might realize this can be rephrased to, how do I prepare my Android app for localized content? So what content is localizable? Well, strings are probably the most obvious, but also numbers and currency, which we'll be spending some time on, dates and time as well. My least favorite, images with text on them. You really want to avoid this. If a designer gives you an image that's got text on it, you really want to try to change that to, you know, whatever kind of background with like a text view on top of it, because it's just not very nice when you have to come back and localize this content later. Plus, you know, it's more performant. And also audio and video files, which we won't be spending any time on, but just something to keep in mind. So the content of your app probably lives in two different places, in your resource files and your Java code. And it's really where these things cross over that you want to be mindful of. So when you're doing some dynamic display of numbers or currency in your strings, that's where some of these formatting issues can happen. It can be easy to forget about when you're just coding up your feature and you're throwing in some dynamic data and then you forget to format it. So probably all of you are familiar with the default resources. I'm sure you all have your default strings.xml. And the default resources are important because if a user comes to your app and they're using a different locale, Android will use the default resources if it can't find any resources specific to that locale. So even if you have, like for example, in English, there's a locale for the United States and for the United Kingdom and Australia, etc. There are some subtle differences there, like in England they spell color with an U, and in America we don't. So maybe you want to have a resource, a string, that has that different spelling for the UK, and then maybe you only need it in that one place, and that's the only other resource that you need. You don't have to copy over the entire all the rest of the strings. So you can define alternates as you need them. And they have these cute little flags next to them, which appeals to me greatly. So strings, probably the number one lesson that I hope you all know already, but it bears repeating, is that don't hard code any strings that face the user. It's really just going to come back to bite you later. You want to have those all extracted out into your strings file, or if you like to break things out into multiple XML files, that's fine too, but please don't hard code it in your Java code. You should also use these nifty position placeholders. I don't have a great name for these, but you'll probably be familiar with them if you've got this %s placeholder where you are going to stick some dynamic data later. If you have two of them and then say in a different language you need to flop the position of these two arguments, you can't do that with the first example, but you can do it with the second just by changing where those appear. And then you don't have to worry about later in your arguments being in the wrong order. You should also provide as much context for your translators as possible to help make their jobs easier so that then they can translate things quickly and get them back to you. And this is the kind of thing that's very easy to do while you're coding up a feature, but it makes it a lot harder to do when you have to do them all at once. So please just take the time to take a note about how strings are used, and especially if something is a little bit ambiguous, just jot that down. They will thank you. Here's another lint error that I really love. So if I'm coding up my text to you and I've hard-coded this English string in my text, it will give me this great warning that says, hey, you should be using an @string resource for this. Please don't hard-code it. So Android is going to try to help you out as much as possible, which I feel like has been a good theme today in other talks. Pay attention to lint errors. They're there for a reason. Another thing you can do is you can mark your strings as translatable false. So in this example, the name of my company, Indiegogo, we're Indiegogo all around the world. You don't need to translate that string. So you can mark it as translatable false, and this will produce some helpful lint errors, such as this thing is translated, but it shouldn't be, or maybe it needs to be translated, but it's not. There's kind of a point that I'm not sure where I picked this up, but it's actually really useful, and we use it in the Indiegogo app. XML is extensible, so you can just plop in whatever property you want. We use this note property for that translator context. And this is sort of a little more readable than xlif. If y'all have seen that, I actually don't have an xlif example in here because I realize we've totally replaced them with these. So just sort of give some more context around what this string is, how it's used. And we actually use this as part of our integration into SmartLang, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But this is a screenshot from our SmartLang dashboard, and you can see that we've just plopped that note straight into the SmartLang dashboard for our translators to see and use that. And that's all automated. So let's take a moment to talk about numbers and currencies. If you've never used a number format before in Java, it's actually really easy. So you just get an instance of it and you use it. And this is what that same content looks like in two different languages. So in the United States, we use a comma for our number delimiter, much like in Japan. But a lot of places in Europe, they actually use a dot to delimitate numbers. So you can imagine, like this is going to look very confusing to someone. If you're American like me and you come to the second one and you go, I don't understand what's 36.9 contributions. What is that? That doesn't mean anything to me. So that's why this kind of thing is important. Android has great support for plurals. And if y'all aren't using this, you definitely should, because it's actually super robust. So what you do is, let's say you want to display how many friends the user has. And this is sort of a classic lazy developer example, at least in English, because Japanese doesn't have plurals, right? Where you don't bother to code in the singular example. So you'll see stuff like 1 friends, right? And then that's just lazy. Don't do that. So what you can do is you can use this getQuantityString API. And the arguments that this takes, the first one is an int, and here it's called count. And if that's 1, it's going to go to that 1 line, and if it's anything else, it's going to go to the other line. The second argument can be a string, and in this example, it's a number formatted number. So that's going to go there where that %s placeholder is. And I've seen a lot of examples of this API where they just pass count twice. So it's 2 ints, but you can't number, but that number's not going to be number formatted. So that led me to this piece of advice: beware of %d. A lot of the times you want to number format these numbers that are showing up in your UI. So if you have this in there, maybe think again. You probably want to be number formatting that number instead. Obviously, if you're sending data to a server or something like that, don't format it. It needs to be an int. But in your UI, you probably want %s instead. OK, this is one of my favorite topics for some reason. I don't know, just properly formatted dates I think are really great. So out of the box, you get 3 date formats. Get date format is actually the short date format. Get medium date format and get long date format. To use these, it's very similar. You just get a date format instance, and you format a date object. And I actually changed this example. I used to have this example in English US and Japan, but I figured since I was just in Australia and we're in Japan, and most of you know what Japanese dates look like, I'm going to use this example instead. So in the United States, we put month, then day, then year, but a lot of the rest of the, even in English-speaking world, does it the other way, where it goes day, and then month, and then year, which can cause a lot of confusion, because if I'm American and I'm looking at the second date, I think that's July. It's not, though. It's August. So it just goes to show that even within the same language, a different region might have different date formats. And if you just pass a hard-coded date format string, it's not going to take the locale into consideration. So this is all well and good, but this is only 3 date formats. And maybe you're like us and you want some custom date formats. Like you want to just show perhaps the month and the year. So here's how you do this in API 18+, and I'll get to the others in a second. You can use this awesome API that's get best date time pattern, and you just pass it the components you want. So here we've passed it a month and a year, and then we format that date. And then the output we get is just properly formatted per the locale. So English US, that's August 2015. But in Japanese, it's switched around, the years first and then the month, because that's the right way to write it. But notice how our pattern, we actually didn't write it in that order. You can write it in any order you want. And that's awesome. But if you're like Indiegogo was when we were coding up our app, you have to support APIs below 18. I don't know, no, I'm kidding. Actually, what we did is we collected custom date formats as we needed them and kept them in our resources, just like any other kind of string that we had to change based on the language. And this worked out for us because we only support 3 languages other than English, and we didn't have too many custom date formats. The sad thing, though, is that Android will still format to the user's locale even if you don't support it. So they might still, so for example, if you use the Indiegogo app in Japanese, there will still be some funny looking Japanese formatted dates, which is just kind of unfortunate. If you need to do a lot of heavy lifting with your date formatting, I recommend bringing in some big guns like JodaTime. JodaTime is a really big library, though, so you might want to be just judicious there, but sometimes it is the right solution. So I was, when in her talk talked about spanables just now, I was like, oh no, I'm going to totally take down spanables. But I think that our 2 pieces of advice can coexist. So how many of you have worked with spanables or spanable string before? Yeah, I don't like them. And here's why. They've got this int start and int end as part of their API. So what that means, if you want to do something like the above example, where you've got a differently formatted chunk of your text right in the middle, you're going to have to know the exact index where that happens. And what happens when you translate this text? You're maybe not going to know where that is anymore. So you can certainly find it some other way. But what I recommend instead is you just replace it with HTML in your strings files. And in Wynn's example, she was kind of doing like a whole chunk of text at once, right? You could just keep appending and changing styles. So I think that that's fine. But if you want to do this ugly right in the middle thing, then I recommend just slapping some HTML in your strings file, like right here. I've got a bold tag as part of this string. And if you need to do this dynamically, you can just call setText with HTML from HTML. This isn't a perfect solution. There are a lot of tags that aren't supported. And if you have any particular designer friends like I do, they are going to catch that this bold is not a true bold. It is a bolded regular weight. So there are some caveats, but we'll all live. It's better than the alternative. I want to talk a little bit about building flexible layouts. I think that this could actually be a whole other talk on itself. So if you're looking for content for your next conference talk, I think this would be a great one. But I will say briefly, thank God for wrap content. If you've ever developed for a different framework or like HTML to try to center stuff vertically, things have gotten better. Flexbox is here to help us out. If you've ever done iOS, auto constraints are like the worst. And I just love wrap content so much. It's the best. So I think it's helpful to be grateful for what you've got, right? Be mindful of your line length. So if you have some content that really needs to fit into a specific space, but when you translate that, maybe it's going to overflow or not show all of the text, you need to be mindful of that. And luckily for all of us as Android developers, wrap content makes that very easy, right? So keep that in mind as you're building your layouts. And think about these kind of situations where maybe your designer friend really wanted that to be real bolded text, but you said, no, actually, I need to put this all as one string and do like we did in the previous example with the bold tag, because if you had this as two separate text views and you needed to switch these two pieces of data around, you need to define an alternate layout, and that's a huge pain. So you should just be flexible when designing your layouts. Use those position placeholders. They're there for you. So what other cool things can we do? There's this neat feature built into Android Studio that's the Android Studio Translations Editor. If you open up your strings file, you might have never noticed, like I had never noticed, this little open editor. And then you get this really great side-by-side view of all of your translations. And you can do a couple cool things here. You can check and uncheck the translatable box. You can edit these directly, sort of make sure everything looks consistent and good. It will sort of jump out at you if you've got things that need to be translated. So this is neat. There's another little button over here that's Order Your Translation. And this actually pops straight into the Google Play app translation service. I've heard some not great things about this, though. So please use this at your own risk. It's definitely best if you have people as part of your organization who speak the language that you are attempting to translate into. Because ultimately, people who work with you are going to understand your business logic the best. And I think probably Google uses a lot of machine translation, which is also not great. So you really want to be mindful of keeping the quality of your app high. And I know this can be difficult to do, especially if you have a lot of languages you're trying to localize into. But this is not a be-all, end-all solution, but probably a decent start. If your app is already live, you can check out in the Google Play Developer Console some statistics about what language and countries your users are in. It'll also tell you how your app compares to other apps in your category. And this is just the first little statistics button right here. So this might help you make a use case to your product manager about what areas you might want to target, what areas you could be improving in. And sort of lastly, I wanted to give a shout out to SmartLang. SmartLang is a service that we use for our translations, and we were already using them on our website, so it sort of made sense for us to keep using them for our mobile apps. And they have an API and a Java SDK, so we do a lot of cool automated stuff with that. It makes it really easy to update our string files. It's basically just a push and a pull. So this is just a sample of this output. We push up our English strings, and then we pull down the changes from SmartLang for the rest of our languages. And it doesn't do a diff or anything like that. It just completely overwrites our local files. So it does mean that we can't really futz around with our non-English strings too much locally. Any editing we have to do it through SmartLang's interface online. But ultimately, I think that this saves us a lot of time, and you can integrate this into your CI and that kind of thing. So I think that's pretty sweet. Google has a lot of really good resources on localizing. I would recommend reading them thoroughly. There's a blog post about the Google Play app translation service, and then SmartLang's API and Java SDK. And there is a slightly different version of these slides that's already online, but I'm going to be posting this version probably a little bit later today. So I hope that you can all go out and now be localization champions. I'm happy to take any questions. Nihongo demo ii desu yo. And I'm Siena time.
Do you have any questions? Question time?
Yeah.
So one problem I'm having on my app right now is that it is not easy to check the translations after it's translated by some outsourced service. Is there any alternative tool that you have experience using that like automates going through your app and taking screenshots of localized content?
So you mean, so you're talking about checking quality or checking that like every string has actually been translated?
Checking the quality.
Checking the quality. I mean, I think that that's hard because, like I mentioned earlier, you really need someone who both speaks the language and is familiar with your business to really check that for you. So I don't really know, honestly, but I'm curious if anyone else has any suggestions. I think it's a hard thing, right? Because I don't think this is a problem we can actually solve with computers. I think this is a human problem.
So let me rephrase that.
Sure.
How do you QA the translation?
Well, we have people in-house who speak the languages, and that's part of the reason why we only support 4 languages, is because we have customer support people who speak all of those languages so that we can properly support those communities. So that's kind of just a business trade-off that we've made.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have another one.
Thank you.
Okay. So you're talking about SmartLang.
SmartLang.
What functions does it provide?
So basically so we use them in our Rails app also, but they basically understand how to take something like an XML file from your Android app and then give you back the output that you need, which is, you pick which languages you want, and then it does a smart thing where like basically every line of your XML file is like a new issue basically that's open, and then someone translates it, it goes through QA, you can choose to approve it or not approve it, and then download the new XML file.
Okay, that's great.
It's cool. It costs money, but
Yeah. One other problem is how is the context for example, I see that you translate in German, right? So you have genders in some languages that can be like in a placeholder in a string, for example. How is that context provided? Is everything into that node attribute?
I mean, that's where we put it. And that sort of thing is you sort of have to open up a conversation with your translator then. And in SmartLang, they provide an interface for like, if someone has a question about this string, they'll be like, oh, in German, blah, 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 gender something, something. And then it's kind of up to you or someone on your team to get back to them and be like, well, here's the context in which we're using it. So, like I said, human problem, not computer problem.
Okay, so a lot of human interaction.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just because I love languages and I really believe in the power of human translation over machine translation, but I just really don't ever think that machine translation is ever going to be as good as a human who understands what's going on. So, but that's maybe my controversial opinion since I was not a computer science major. I majored in Japanese and English, so those are my passions, and that's what I believe in.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Nihongoでもいいですよ。
日本語だと曜日を表示するときに漢字で月火水木金出てますね。で、デザイナーさんから、 英語にしたいと、例えば THU とか
Mhm.
RI とかで表示したい。でも他の言語の時はそのローカライゼーションを使いたいという時にはどうしたらいいですか？
So the question was, Lynn, someone let me know if I didn't get this right. So the designer wants to display the days of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. In Japanese, you have kanji for those that are just, you can do them with just one character for the days of the week. And then in English, it'd be something like mun, to, wins, something like that. But what about other languages? I think that was the question.
Yeah, the question was, so although the application is translated into Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
the designer wants that the day of the week to be displayed in English. Is that correct?
Here in
曜日
English,
は日本語になっているんだけど、曜日は、英語で表示したいという
yes.
ことで。Yeah, so that is.
So then would it be the same in all languages? Sorry, I'm just trying to understand. I mean, if you don't want to translate that, you don't have to. But すみません、ちょっとわかりません。ごめんなさい、本当に。もし後で個人的の話したいから。
Thank you.
So my question is, have you experienced like RTM, right to left handed?
Well, no. Actually, I mentioned that at the very beginning. Probably went by too fast. I haven't actually done any of that. I think Konifa-san was going to talk about it in his talk. So,
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't mention this, but I'm sure probably everyone has seen the like the start and end attributes in XML. So yes, you should use those. I know it's annoying, but but it's important for supporting right to left languages. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, thanks.
Okay, so thank you for your amazing talk, Siena.
Thank you.